Smith. Maybe a couple of seconds and I will.
Debate is an important element of progress. Welcome to this week's episode of A View from Afar. This week we examine what's going on between China and the USA. Is China positioning as a global power while the USA under US President Donald Trump is more isolationist, or is there more to it on the home front? But before we examine what's going on, just remember, if you're joining us via social media, we can see your comments and we can see your questions, so do interact, and the best of those we can include in the program. So let's take a look at the main points that we will discuss tonight. Here's the thing here, View from Afar with Paul Buchanan. Now, Paul Buchanan, of course, is very well known for his expertise in security intelligence, and we're going to discuss here China versus the United States. Is this Cold War II? Is this the United States positioning against the People's Republic of China? All of these questions we'll be alluding into. So let's get straight to Paul Buchanan, who's online right now and waiting for us to get into this discussion. Hello, Paul.
Hi, Sal.
So how do you read the beginning of this, from the point of view of why is China asserting itself? Particularly this week, we've seen some pretty amazing things starting to show.
Well, I think that its origins are actually domestic in nature, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is a window of opportunity for China to press its advantage on the global stage, to present the United States in particular, but the West in general, with what we might call a fait accompli, that is, established facts on the ground, to include the island building project in the South China Sea, but not limited to that. And the window of opportunity is presented by the fact that the United States is in clear retreat on the international stage, and ironically, that too has domestic origins. So there's an old adage in international relations that all foreign policy begins at home. And in this case, these two countries have come to loggerheads. because they have different domestic motivations, different urges that compel them to confront each other. But nevertheless, they have. And so for the foreseeable future, we're going to see the tensions rise. And let's be clear, in the Chinese case, they have to press their advantages as much as they can before November 3rd.
Okay, so let's just have a look at that. You're not alone in this kind of position either, Paul. If we look at The Economist, obviously a very well positioned media outlet on the global stage, and let's just take a look at how it sees this latest situation here between China and the United States.
A global crisis needs global leadership. For most of the past 75 years, that leader has been America. No longer.
World leaders held an online summit today pledging billions to develop a coronavirus vaccine. Notably absent from the meeting were any officials from the Trump administration.
I'm instructing my administration to halt funding of the World Health Organization.
America's retreat has left a vacuum at the top.
Every time that America steps back, that's an opportunity for China to step forward and present itself as the champion of the world order.
Has China spotted an opportunity to steal a march on America and use the soft power of global diplomacy to hasten its rise as the world's top power?
So, Paul, you've been listening to that and seeing that. Is this how you see it? Is The Economist right on message here? Are we seeing China stepping in, asserting itself as an equal on the world stage as a superpower alongside the United States, particularly as the United States retreats within its own borders?
Yeah, there's a couple items there that I disagree with. And China has moved beyond soft power into the realms of hard power, which is military, and sharp power, which is influence operations in other states to subvert them from within. But let's back up a little bit. The Trump administration's retreat from world affairs, some of which was not ill-considered. If you think about removing the United States from its military presence across the world, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But the abrogation of treaties, the full retreat from international organizations is a neo-isolationist move, and it's one that removes a lot of the sources of leverage that the United States traditionally has had with both allies and adversaries alike. It spells, in other words, the end of the liberal world order, the liberal internationalism, which was based on the belief that the combination of democratic governance and market economies was the best possible political economic form for the world at large. Now, China has stepped in, but we have to be clear here. The assumption seems to be that China is, and it is, an ascendant great power, whereas the United States is a descendant great power. And if you want, if we have time, we can talk about that. But the Chinese are responding to internal dynamics that are actually born of uncertainty, born of some degree of insecurity. And I'll give you a...
This is back home? This is back in the PRC?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so case in point, you may recall that last year, President Jinping Xi rejigged the Constitution to make himself president for life. He's going to die in office. Now, that was interpreted in the West as a consolidation of his strongman authority, and he's definitely an authoritarian. But there's a couple of things involved there. The first one is that China had an orderly presidential succession mechanism where a president would be in office for several years, would retire, and the number two person in the Chinese Communist Party would succeed him. With this move last year, President Xi has disrupted that succession order. And you can imagine if you're the number two or number three guy in the Chinese Communist Party, you're part of the cadre of people that Xi came up through the ranks, and he pulls a stunt like this in front of you. I won't say that the knives are out, but it's going to leave some people very aggrieved within the Chinese Communist Party.
So this indication of authoritarianism extending its presence, particularly in the South China Sea, but obviously that's very precious to it, but right across the Pacific, and really starting to ratchet up. It's military might. I mean, we haven't seen a lot of this since the Cold War times. So have a look at this. I'll just go to a clip here. This is DW News, of course, and if you look at this, I won't necessarily put the audio on, but you know, the people here watching this will get the gist. There's it goes into this discussion about you know, the problems back home relating to coronavirus, etc., but at the same time, in tandem, in parallel, pushing the military might. So I guess if we get back to that point you were making there, that there are political problems back home that would be thinking, hey, in our lifetime, we wanted an opportunity to actually ascend into the leadership as well. This group here, we've been expecting that to occur perhaps in 10, 15 years' time. And you're saying, well, that's out. So these tensions back home are being addressed by nationalism. Is that correct? Summarising what you're saying?
Yeah, by and large. I mean, the reassertion of authoritarian control in the persona of Jinping Xi is in response to a couple of things. One is he fears the liberalization of the Chinese political system, dominated by the Communist Party, but there are many factions within the Communist Party. We have to be clear. China as a nation, and certainly the CCP, is not this monolith, not this homogeneous unit that many people think it's made out to be. And secondly, there have been some failures of leadership on the part of President Xi. The initial response to the coronavirus in Wuhan was very poorly managed, both at the local level but at the national level. The genocidal treatment of the Uyghurs has backlashed internationally. Yep. And eroded any pretense that the Han Chinese have that they are not racial cleansing.
And there's Hong Kong, of course.
And yes, and then there's Hong Kong, where, you know, they have basically violated the 1997 devolution agreement with this new security law, a security law that has no standing in international law when it comes to extraditing dissenters from foreign countries. I mean, that simply is a norm violation, and that's where things get interesting. This move to assert China's presence, not only in its near abroad in the South China and East China seas, but now extending into the Blue Pacific, extending into Africa. These moves are typical authoritarian diversionary moves. Whip up nationalist fervor in order to have the public cast their eyes into some foreign venture, some conflict abroad, and not look too closely at what's going on at home, while he could be consolidating his power by purging people within the CP. I mean, they're very opaque in their actions, but this is a traditional diversion. Now, here's the irony. Donald Trump needs one too.
Yeah, I was going to say with Donald Trump, obviously China's got an opportunity here. So what has Donald Trump done to create that opportunity for China? Where is the clumsiness relating to his foreign policy? And what is his next step? Where are we going to be going next? What can we expect next on all of this?
Well, where to begin with the clumsiness? You know, the fact is that American retreat does present a window, because China is engaged in systematic norm violation of international laws, those sort of things, not just with its island building project, but in a number of areas. They're not behaving as a responsible international citizen. So the idea that China would replace the rules-based order, or the role of the United States in the rule-based order, has yet to be seen.
And we've even seen, perhaps, if we were going to actually consider that, you see China's approach of asserting its one nation status relating to the new laws in Hong Kong as underscoring what you're saying there. It is not respecting what we would consider international law and the norm. There is a new norm here, it's authoritarianism, and it would be anyone that steps out of line, says something that China back in Beijing doesn't agree with, bang, potentially life imprisonment. So that is standing out, isn't it? Of an abandonment of what the acceptable norm is in a multilateral world.
But who's going to enforce the norms against the Chinese violations? The UN? No, they won't. There is no great power. I mean, I'll give you a parallel so that we don't, we're not sitting here China bashing. Chemical weapons have been used in Syria.
Yep.
They've been used by the Syrian regime. They've been used by the Russians. Is anyone going to sanction either one of those actors? No. Why? There's no enforcement capability behind the rules-based order. Lacking an enforcement capability, you don't have order. It's
So,
might makes right.
if you look at that, of course, there is the International Criminal Court, of which the United States is not a signatory to. In fact, it goes hostile against the ICC repeatedly. You've got the UN Security Council, where all it takes is a veto by one of the members of that, particularly the permanent members, and a thing is dropped. So it's more a mechanism of non-action, isn't it, in a sense, rather than actually sorting out the global problem where there is breaches of what would be considered a legal norm.
Right. The powerful have to agree to the self-limiting strategy that is acceptance of UN jurisdiction, international court jurisdiction. The big players have to accept this if they're going to have any effectiveness whatsoever. And we're in a transitional moment in international politics. We're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And the two things that happen in these moments of transition are A, norm violations becomes regularized. Literally, it's might makes right, push come to shove. And the second one is that conflict becomes the system's regulator at the economic level, at the diplomatic level, and unfortunately at the military level. And this is the interesting thing, because the U.S. withdrawal from the world stage is not just its withdrawal from various organizations, but it is very clear that the United States is a broken society. It's fractured from within, and Trump has accelerated those fractures. He relishes them, but that's not good for the nation as a whole. Let's remember, the United States is a nation state. The state's still there, but the nation is breaking apart. That means that there's an erosion of will, there's erosion of commitment to tough international tasks. And quite frankly, if you were to pick a fight with the United States today, Americans are war-weary. They haven't won a war in ages. I mean, the last time they won was when they kicked Saddam out, but even that turned into a debacle, and we got ISIS, thanks to the U.S. invasion.
So if we look at Donald Trump's presidency here, is it fair to say, in the first instance, that the opportunity for China to assert its position on the world stage has been created in part by the move toward isolationism and also clumsy foreign affairs that's coming out of the White House of late, and this poking of the stick back at China from the United States, including only yesterday when Pompeo was trying to get the Australians to put pressure and hardware into the South China Sea to antagonise the Chinese. Is that the diversion back home as well? Just like you were underscoring before about China's got its problems politically back home, clearly Donald Trump has got his problems back in the United States, that this is actually something that's an advantage for him to be able to say, yeah, we're going to push those Chinese back to where they came from, so it serves his electoral needs.
Absolutely. I mean, they, just as the Chinese can point to the United States as a major adversary in order to rally domestic support for its foreign adventurism, so Trump, just like he has done at home, can play the race card. He's appealing to the specter of the yellow peril. Once again, he's going to go down the path of blaming people who look different, whose culture is different, but all for electoral gain. I mean, he may have talked about his new trade deal and what have you, but once we got into the election cycle this year, especially in light of the non-response to the pandemic and all the negative economic sequels that have followed from that, he's going full on with the race card, both at home and abroad. And so the Chinese are easy to pick on. They make it easy Because again, their misbehavior on the international stage allows Trump the moment of opportunity, if you will, to play the anti-China card for his own public. See, his trouble is that he may have his MAGA base, which may be up to 30% of the electorate, but he still needs the undecided, the fence straddlers. And one way to whip up a frenzy in his favor is to get tough on foreign adversaries. Well, the specter of Islamic terrorism has abated quite a bit. And so if you can't pick on extremist Muslims, which he tried to do early in his administration, pick on the Chinese. You know, they're the next most convenient target.
He's not going to pick on the Russians. He's not going to.
Well,
he's not going after the Russians, is he? So.
I think his boss wouldn't allow him to do that. So, we'll leave the Russians. But no, so you know, what he's doing at home in terms of supporting the symbols of the Confederacy, blaming Black Lives Matters movement as anarchists, saying that they're all to blame for rising crime in the cities and what. All these sort of subterfuges, this dog whistling to the real racists, is what he's doing with the Chinese. He's making it more about who they are as opposed to what they're doing. Because the United States has a mixed track record when it comes to violating international norms and the like. So I think it's very vulgar, crass in fact, but it's a tried and true ploy when it comes to election politics in the United States. And the irony here is that it has its mirror image in President Xi's need for foreign diversions from some of his troubles at home.
Yeah, that's very clear, isn't it? Now, from the point of view of the South Pacific, or the Indo-Asia, South Pacific, Oceania kind of region of the world, Australia is right smack in the middle of this. Obviously, China has been kicking back at China's been kicking back at the Australians via trade and saying, okay, you're dancing with Donald Trump here. We're going to hit you on pulling back our cooperation relating to our free trade agreement. New Zealand is potentially, sitting there more independent perhaps, or trying to actually assert a more independent position. And China's been softer on that. But also early this week, China saying to New Zealand, you're in breach of international law here and we're not going to tolerate this over various issues. So it really boiled down to New Zealand's criticism of China's handling of Hong Kong. So if we look at what the United States' response to all of this is, it seems like with the Australians in the very least, the United States is ratcheting up the pressure. Just have a look at this clip here. This is ABC in Australia.
Masks are off, the niceties gone. The message on China is now blunt.
It is unacceptable for Beijing to use exports or student fees as a cudgel against Australia.
The Chinese Communist Party's activities were labelled malign on the open seas, on Hong Kong's streets, and in its efforts to dominate the technologies of the future. Australia was praised for holding the line.
Despite intense, continued, coercive pressure from the Chinese Communist Party to bow to Beijing's wishes.
There was talk of expanding war games off Australia's north coast to include other regional allies, and the US wants Australia to push freedom of navigation exercises further into the disputed South China Sea.
So, Paul, if you're looking at that, do you agree with my premise that the United States is willingly intensifying the pressure in the South Pacific between Australia and the People's Republic of China on this very point of putting military hardware, Australian military hardware, into the prized areas of China's shipping lanes, where it's trying to secure up, obviously, its supply chains and maintain them through this? So, if that is the case, can you just talk to those points first, Paul, and we'll see what you make of that.
Well, it's pretty clear that over the last 20 years, Australia has aspired to be the sheriff's deputy in the Southern Hemisphere. And its pro-American stance is extremely clear. So it's not surprising that the Australians would respond more vigorously to U.S. entreaties to harden the line when it comes to the People's Republic of China. I mean, there's 1,500 Marines stationed in Darwin, an overseas expeditionary force. The Australians received the latest in American military technology. And they work hand in hand with the United States Navy throughout the Western Pacific. So the alliance is really quite strong. What makes it interesting is that Australia has some leverage on the Chinese that New Zealand certainly does not, besides size. And that is that Australia has strategic minerals that China needs: iron ore, uranium, coal. All of these minerals the Chinese depend on, and they depend very heavily on Australia's exports of these minerals. So it's not as if China can just cut them off. It can do its influence operations, it can threaten, it can bluster, it can refuse to allow its students to go for English language education in Australia. But the real source of the trade relationship between the two countries, which are these strategically important minerals, that hasn't been affected. The Chinese are not going to go down that path. They don't have substitutes for Australian suppliers.
Such as the necessity for it to develop. It needs Australia. At the same time, from New Zealand's point of view, does China actually need its commodities that it's exporting there, the forestry, the agricultural products, the milk products, etc.? Do you see the same kind of balance there, that China actually needs that kind of thing?
No, I don't.
No.
And yeah, I've likened this because the discussions always come up. If the Australians go a certain way, will New Zealand go a certain way? Let me put it to you this way. No, we don't have any. We have a lot of consumer non-durables in terms of commodities that we export. All of those can be cut off in a day. The Chinese don't need milk powder. I mean, it's good for their rising middle class to have access to infant formula and the like. They would be reluctant to jeopardize the flow of such things, the forestry projects, but they could. And they'll find substitutes. I mean, I immediately come to mind, if you need milk powder, turn to Brazil. Now, the Brazilians may or may not want to play ball. But the fact is that New Zealand is in a very precarious position. I've likened it over the years to, it's like straddling a barbed wire fence while standing on ice blocks.
So you mentioned, yeah, I get that. It's
not going to be pleasant.
It's a good way of putting it. You mentioned Brazil there and China in the same sentence, and of course there's the BRICS nations, isn't it? So do you see that China could push that cooperation amongst the BRICS, and that's obviously Brazil, China, there's India, there's conflict there, and Russia and South Africa, of course, sitting there with its COVID problems as well. So do you see some sort of formulation there strengthening it?
Well, it's really interesting that you bring that up, because Brazil, unfortunately, is following the United States into decline. One of the jokes the Brazilians make is that we're the country of the future and we always will be. And the fact is, under Bolsonaro, it's doing like a mini-me on the Trump administration's approach, and they're in disarray. I mean, Brazil can't do much today. So they've declined in terms of the BRICS. China will be a great power. There's no doubt about it. But its time has yet to come. But the interesting thing here is that China runs the risk of overstepping its boundaries. It has managed to produce a backlash against its constant, repeated norm violation. I'll give you a for instance. The Southeast Asia Treaty Organization is a toothless wonder. That includes, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines. They've never been able to do anything militarily wise, and yet now they are joining in freedom of navigation patrols alongside the United States, alongside the Australians, alongside the Japanese, because they feel threatened by Chinese actions. And the Chinese continue to do things that are extremely provocative, like ram Indonesian fishing vessels. Again, they're not playing nice, and their neighbors really resent that. Now
Exactly,
Well, it also turns out further afield, we've always heard about their dollar diplomacy, and especially amongst the smaller Pacific Island states.
As a way in until the point where the PS...
With the Belt and Road Initiative, it's been replaced by debt diplomacy. They give huge loans to African countries, not so much Pacific Island countries, South American countries. And then when there's a crunch in terms of payments, the Chinese then turn around and say, well, we'll take some of your assets, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And that's breeding resentment. They're not being nice lenders.
Okay.
So here's the trouble, is the Chinese may not have learned from the lesson of other great imperial powers, because that's what they're becoming, in that they're pushing their advantage too strongly, too hard, for their own reasons. Again, they have a window of opportunity that they see, and they want to make the most of that window of opportunity, but the subtleties of international diplomacy and trade seem to have been lost on them. And then if you look at, their naval operations in their near waters, South China Sea and East China Sea, they're extremely aggressive, and they violate maritime law. They're basically behaving quite a bit certainly, and their neighbors have responded.
So your message there, to paraphrase down, and correct me if I'm wrong, is China, you respect, and everybody respects the saving face type of culture where you treat China with respect, etc. But it's a two-way thing. Treat your neighbours, treat your friends in the same way. Is that where you're going with that? Am I paraphrasing correctly?
No, that's certainly part of it. I mean, the Chinese, a friend of mine, an old Pentagon hand, once said to me that if you deal with China today, it's like dealing with a 16-year-old who weighs, 150 kilos. This
is the United States view, from the Pentagon view of China.
They think they're an immature great power.
That could come around to bite, couldn't it?
Well, whether they're a mature great power or an immature, they're here to stay.
Yeah.
And they can be very dangerous if provoked. See, let's think about it strategically, the balancing. If the United States was to get into a shooting war with the Chinese around the various island building projects in the South China Sea, that would be an expeditionary task that the United States would have to project force across the Pacific into the South China Sea, and China is right there. So it'll be a very costly venture for the United States, and one has to wonder, given that the U.S. Navy has had its own troubles as of late, whether there's the will to sustain any sort of conflict with the Chinese in order to prevail to the point that the Chinese will desist from island building, from claiming territorial waters of adjacent states. That's an open question, and the Chinese strategic planners, they're undoubtedly spend a lot of their days thinking about what's the threshold of toleration for the United States and its allies.
Testing.
Think about it. Will we or the Australians send warships to back the United States in a confrontation with the Chinese?
I can't see that. Okay, let's, and certainly New Zealand wouldn't be. So yeah.
So I think what would send it?
Yeah, exactly. So let's wrap this up. Where do you see this tracking between now and the elections in the United States in November?
My impression is that if we're going to see any sort of armed confrontation, it's going to occur at a very low level between now and November 3rd. And it'll be the product of miscalculation, misperception. Someone's going to run into each other, and hard words will be exchanged, and then some shooting will happen. But for the Chinese perspective, it is this. If Trump loses the election on November 3rd, he'll never concede defeat. But if it's recognized that he lost and he's forced to leave, then Joe Biden will reverse almost everything that Trump has done in the last 3 years, particularly on the foreign stage. He'll resume the United States relationship. Now, he may be trying to capture lost glory. I mean, let's be honest. The United States may not be able to reestablish its position in the world. It certainly will not be the dominant hegemon, the sole superpower. Now, it's going to have to live with a constellation of other great states, that are emerging now and will continue to emerge over the next couple of decades. But Biden will reassert the U.S. presence in the international arena, and he will re-engage with the Chinese at a very different level. And I have a feeling that the Chinese know all of this and realize that Biden may be many things, but he's a very experienced statesman. And I'll leave you with that term.
And they had experience of him, obviously, earlier on.
They know him.
Yeah.
They know him. They know what to expect. He's sort of hawkish on the Democratic side. But again, I'll leave you with this thought. Whatever you want to think of the United States and of the presidential calendars, when you think of Donald Trump, the word statesman does not come to mind.
Certainly doesn't in my mind.
Many things come to mind, but the word statesman is not one of them. The Chinese want respect, and they'll give respect to someone who recognizes their legitimate ambitions as a rising great power. Only a statesman can give them that.
Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Great program. Thank you very much. Okay. And thank you to our audience for watching and listening and digesting A View from Afar.